Okay, thanks. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to share some of my research. I'm a postdoc working at Georgia Tech with Sam Renae right now. And I'm talking today about integrating thermodynamic melting models and geophysical images to try and estimate magma reservoir conditions. And in the spirit of SZ4D, where we're supposed to be integrating across disciplines, I thought maybe as a geophysicist, I could actually put a rock on my opening slide and just show that, rocks actually matter. So brief outline here. I'll zoom out first and just give an overall view of MT and subduction zones, just because MT is kind of an odd duck that doesn't get too much attention. And then I'll talk about melting and bulk resistivity and how those influence each other. And then I'll go through three case studies, Mono Basin, Newberry Volcano, and Laguna del Maule volcanic field. And I'll go through these pretty quickly, just to give a flavor of what we're doing, not an exhaustive overview. And finally, a few cans of worms that this opens up, this kind of methodology that we're looking at, which can be more optimistically phrased as future directions. So just zooming way out at a conceptual model of a subduction zone that everyone's very familiar with, the subducting slab coming down with fluids coming out. And I'll just highlight that there's a lot of fluids that people talk about coming in at the outer rise, and then as they dehydrate as it goes down, and along with that you have melts at the volcanic arc, perhaps a mash zone in the lower crust with more shallow reservoirs beneath particular volcanic edifices. And MT is uniquely really sensitive to fluids, both partial melts and aqueous fluids. And so this conceptual model is not taken from a textbook or anything, it's just drawn on top of an MT model. This is from the Maule region, Chile, at 36 degrees south. And so what you can see with the MT is it's really good at imaging these fluids across a wide range of spatial scales. You've got some fluids coming out in the forearc, which are imaged as red blobs, which are conductors. And again, more electrically conductive materials are usually aqueous fluids or melts. So if you see red, you can kind of think, okay, that's probably fluids or melts. And beneath the volcanic arc, you also see some conductors in the lower crust, and then conductors going right up towards volcanic edifices that have known eruptions. And you also see perhaps some partial melts down in the cenosphere with corner flow. And so the point of the slide is just to really highlight that MT is really good at seeing these kinds of features and confirming a lot of what we might expect from our conceptual models. And you can use MT to study the whole subduction zone, like this particular profile. And you can also use MT to study specific parts of the subduction zone. So I'd encourage people to go check out poster number 48 for some exciting results we have from the forearc offshore Alaska. And it's the poster right when you walk into the poster room, so you can't miss it. But this talk today, I'm going to be focusing more on shallow silicic melts in the subduction zone settings beneath the volcanic arc. And I'm really focused even more specifically on large silicic systems that are kind of the ones that are prone to potentially having caldera-forming eruptions. And so just zooming in on that conceptual model, here you have a similar thing, just zoomed in, where you have a lower crustal magma reservoir with perhaps some magma pathways going up towards a shallower magma reservoir beneath a caldera. And once again, with MT, we're able to get these really beautiful 3D images of these magma reservoirs. This is beneath Laguna del Maule in Chile again. And again, we see a kind of lower crustal or mid-crustal magma reservoir here, and then going up towards a shallower reservoir where you have ongoing deformation. And so I've shown you a few models now with different blobs, red blobs that are conductive. But what I'm really interested in is trying to say more about what those red blobs actually are, because the amount of melt is really key to magma mobility and viscosity and therefore eruptibility. And also the amount of melt that might be present has a good correlation with future eruption size. And so we really want to know, is this feature here a melt poor mush that's really rigid and probably not going to erupt, or is it like a huge vat of pure liquid magma that could erupt at any moment? So for that, we're going to talk a little bit about melting and bulk resistivity and kind of trying to get an idea of what are the magma reservoir conditions from the bulk resistivity. So on the left side, I have the geophysics column, and on the right side, I have the thermodynamic melting models, and I'll talk more about how we're kind of integrating those two on the slide. So from the geophysics side, bulk resistivity of partial melt depends primarily on three things: melt fraction, temperature of the melt, and the dissolved water content of the melt. And I say primarily because there are other factors, but just for simplicity's sake, these are the kind of primary ones. So this means that if you have a fixed bulk resistivity, in this case 3 ohm meters, that you get from your MT model, you can construct a parameter space of all the possible interpretations you could make for that particular resistivity anomaly. So on the y-axis I have temperature, x-axis is dissolved water, and then the color is melt fraction here. And as you can see that just with this alone, these are from mostly laboratory empirical relationships, it doesn't really constrain the melt fraction very much, because you could interpret this as 950 degrees, 5 weight% water, and 10% melt, or you could interpret it as 750 degrees, 1 weight% water, and 100% melt. So we really need a better constraint to get an idea of what this particular resistivity feature in our models represents. So for that, I turn to thermodynamic melting models, and this is not just work with myself, but it's work with petrologist Juliana Troke at Smithsonian Institute and Chris Hubert at Brown. And so we're using rhyolite melts, a parameterization of rhyolite melts with a rhyolite composition. And in this case, the melt fraction in equilibrium depends on the temperature of the melt, the total water content, and also the pressure. And so you can construct a very similar parameter space with temperature on the y-axis, total system water on the x-axis, and melt fraction again as the colors. And you might notice that there's some kind of suspicious similarities between these two figures in that they have the exact same variables, melt fraction, temperature of the melt, and water content, with a subtle difference being that the x-axis here is dissolved water content in the melt, whereas this is total system water content. So I'm actually plotting the dissolved water content, which we're just using a simple solubility model to estimate the dissolved water content, which is shown as these dashed contours on this parameter space. So the key thing is that because these are the same variables, for this parameter space, we can actually compute the bulk resistivity for any point on this parameter space, and it's a unique bulk resistivity for that parameter space. So I can plot those contours on here too, and it's getting a little busy at this point because there's like 4 different contour variables. But if you're following, this basically describes the 1 ohm meter contours right here, the 2 ohm meter contours right here, and then I've highlighted the 3 ohm meter contour right here. So these are all the temperature, water content, and melt fraction combinations that explain a 3 ohm meter anomaly from an MT model. And you can actually just map that contour onto this original unconstrained parameter space. And you can see that it ends up collapsing the whole parameter space down to a single line. So now you have a set of variables that explain the magma reservoir conditions for this particular anomaly that are kind of thermodynamically consistent in some way. So just to show how this kind of plays out in practice, I'll run through a couple or 3 case studies real quick. So the first is Mono Basin, which is the youngest part of Long Valley caldera in California. And here they've done MT where they identified, again, you can see these nice 3D images from the MT. They've identified a few conductive features that are about 3 ohm meters at about 10 kilometers depth. And there's also some petrological estimates from past eruptions with temperature and dissolved water content from erupted lavas. And so what we can do is we can plot those petrological constraints on top of this kind of parameter space and show that this MT melts line, which is what I'm calling it, this thermodynamically constrained line, passes right through the petrological constraints that you get from the erupted lavas. And so this, the interpretation is then that this suggests that past reservoir conditions, as recorded by these erupted lavas, are similar to conditions today measured from the MT. And this suggests that the magma reservoir below Mono Basin is a low melt fraction, about 25 to 30% melt, deeper storage zone, which is relatively stable. The second case study I'll just quickly show is Newberry Volcano. This is a large silicic shield volcano in the back arc of Cascadia in Oregon. And here they identified a relatively resistive anomaly at 4 kilometers depth with MT. This is Esteban Bolts Martinez and Adam Schultz did this work. And it's about 25 ohm meters. And again, they have petrological estimates from past eruptions as well with temperatures and dissolved water content. And so in this case, because you're changing both the depth of the feature, it's now at 4 kilometers, and the bulk resistivity of the feature is now 25 ohm meters, your plots all change. So now you've got a fixed 25 ohm meters plotting that parameter space. And this parameter space changes too because you're changing the pressure to 100 MPa instead of 250 MPa. And the main takeaway from this plot is that the 25 ohm meter contour just barely even touches this whole parameter space. And going into this, we didn't know where this 25 ohm meter contour was going to plot in this parameter space. Before you do the work, it could have plotted through here or here, but it ends up plotting just barely through here at all. And it's also at quite a bit lower temperatures when you plot onto this parameter space. It's a lot lower temperatures than what the petrological constraints from past eruptions would suggest. And so the kind of overall interpretation of this is it implies that there's very low water contents and lower temperatures than past eruptions. And so the overall interpretation is that this could be considered a cooling pluton that's in the final stages of a solidification. And then the final case study I'll look at is Laguna del Maule volcanic field in central Chile. And this is a silicic complex that's currently deforming quite rapidly. And here we identified an anomaly at 4 kilometers depth. So this is the same as Newberry, same depth. But the difference being that it's incredibly conductive, 0.3 ohm meters, which is like the same conductivity as seawater, which is very conductive. And you've got petrological estimates from past eruptions here as well. And this is the same model that I showed earlier. And so in this case, when you plot the parameter space, you can see that because it's so conductive, you need a lot of melt to explain this feature. In fact, you basically need 100% melt if you're looking at the petrological constraints. And if you look in this parameter space, you can see that you require temperatures like above 1,000 degrees. And so either you're going to have to say, okay, well, this is like really hot and really high temperature, really high melt fraction, which is probably unrealistic for the scale of this feature. Or this is a hint that there's actually some other conductive phases that you aren't accounting for, such as brines, like aqueous fluids, or metals, sulfides. I was very intrigued by Michelle's talk about the sulfides in the melt earlier, or maybe a hot basaltic intrusion, which is much more conductive. The other possibility is that you have a saturated system with 3 phases, which is a whole can of worms that I haven't even opened in this particular talk. So to finish off the cans of worms or the future directions, I'll first highlight that MT is now regularly able to produce 3D images of the subsurface, and it's a really powerful tool that's really ripe for these integrations with thermodynamic and volcanic models. And the kind of cans of worms is that saturated systems is something that we really haven't even touched. So what is the resistivity of the volatile phase? How do we deal with 3-phase systems? How do they separate out, and how did the volatiles move around in the system? And then the other thing that I'd really like to explore is coupling dynamic simulations to bulk resistivity. So for example, how does including melt segregation impact melt fraction estimates, and what are the scales and resolution issues for MT on that regard? And I'll also highlight that I've only talked about these specific silicic caldera systems, but this kind of thinking and this kind of methodology could be applied to really any composition beyond and settings beyond shallow silicic magma reservoirs. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.